Kevin here. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the process of writing a book. There's a lot of tutorials out there about character development, how to drive a narrative, settings, how to be engaging, how to get the reader to follow along with you. I'm not necessarily going to talk about that. I've actually written 2 books to date. And the first one I wrote was kind of a proof of concept just to see if it's something that I can do. So I chose a topic that I liked a lot. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic story about a daughter and her son. I got it out there on Amazon and basically loved doing the process. But as I was writing that book, I had all kinds of challenges. First of all, I had a really hard time with the timeline. I also struggled with knowing where I was when I returned to write after stepping away for a little bit of time. These things made the process incredibly challenging. A lot of writers maybe don't have that. They write notes and kind of keep track of where they are. I found that that was a challenging process. So after I wrote my first book, I thought back around some of that stuff and said, you know, there's got to be a better way. So when I decided I wanted to write a second book, I actually thought about it and employed a new process. It's something I haven't seen anywhere online. I didn't get it other than just something I cooked up on my own. And you know what? I found that it was actually the secret to writing not only a compelling story, but also managing all of the elements of the story. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about that secret. I'm going to be laying out very simply how I managed my character development, how I managed the story as it relates to time and time of year. Those things are very difficult to do. When I wrote my first story, I actually had my character get into a place, it was roughly August, and I had her stay there for about 6 months. And then I thought to myself, oh, I would love to make it so she could, be traveling down the river in a canoe by herself. But by the time that came up in the story, it was already mid-December, and that just wouldn't work. So I had to go and retool, and whenever I made a change because the direction I took the story was different, I had to go back and look at all the previous chapters and make those changes. It was just very difficult. So when I wrote this book, which actually I have out there on Amazon as well, and I'm going to be creating another video where I'm going to talk about how you can use tools like KDP and tools like ACX to not only get your book out there on Amazon, but also get an audiobook created for your book. There are so many tools today, hiring voice actors, basically getting your books out there in front of customers, getting royalties for your books. All of those things are easier than ever before. So I encourage anyone that has a creative spark, get that spark going. So essentially, I created a little tool that basically was a timeline, and I'm going to be showing an example of that timeline in this video so you can clearly see how I actually used it to develop characters, how I drove the narrative with it, and how it really allowed me to center my story and help the reader stay connected as we moved through. I really think that it was the secret to being able to write my second book in a much more straightforward and easy way. This is the initial timeline that I kind of put together. As you can see, the story begins right before my protagonist was just about to go into high school. And he had a couple friends that he had known since childhood, one of them being Jake, and then also Jake had a girlfriend named Brooke. So I just kind of captured some of my characters down here, and then I really used these little diamonds to really talk about some of the actions that I kind of envisioned in my head that would actually drive some of the narrative. So you can see that it began when something tragic happened to Big Sir, which really impacted Jake, and then Jake and Johnny, which is his name, the protagonist, he actually had his first encounter where he saw something happen with Jake, and that basically started driving the story forward. Now, my story was actually going to have some elements that I wanted the characters to learn along the way.
Like I said, mine's a supernatural fiction book, so I kind of build this system around how they can learn things throughout their journey. So I basically have put in here kind of some of the different times that I could train them, because in this world that I created, I really couldn't talk about, losing the human form before getting into talking about the weakness of man, and also understanding inner silence needed to come before they really started talking about power. And so this is how I kind of captured how my magic would kind of advance, and I put a lot of thought in this. And throughout my story, I use these little tags, these numbers, to kind of keep straight when I would talk about these things. So I needed to make sure that this magic development happened in a linear fashion, and then I also could put these numbers right on scenes, so those characters would kind of talk about some of these things. So I managed that just so it wouldn't become confusing to the reader, but it also helped me unfold the story and drive the narrative. So, as you can see here, some actions happen to the two characters, Johnny and Jake. Jake meets Brooke, and then I started just putting down some scenes I kind of thought about, like when Jake is at home later in the story, somebody will climb in his window, and it was really to talk about some of that development of the character as they started becoming more magical and more mysterious. You'll see that about halfway through my story, I thought about this interesting scene for a football game during school homecoming, so I wanted to make sure I captured that right in the middle of the story. I also had an idea for how I wanted the story to finish up, and that really was in this beach scene. So I just also used this place to kind of talk about some of the things that I was thinking. I did some research with Noalism and medicine men and some of the older ancient Indian practices. I wanted to pull that forward because one of my characters had a lineage where he came from South America. So that's why I actually captured some of that. If you look at the next one, this is just an example of how this kind of developed. You can see I started adding more information. So I had the location of the scene, Big Sur, backyard over pond, outside doing magic. I hadn't figured out what this was going to look like, but I knew I needed that in there. Then I had some school when they went to school for the first time. Also getting into the homecoming, I started fleshing out that a little bit more. Then I came up with some more ideas. And then as I started talking about and thinking more about some of the magic based on the research I did around that world, I started thinking about how there might be differences between the characters. I wanted to just think about how their energy might appear differently to those that had enough energy to see it. So that's why I started doodling down things like what does a sorcerer may look like, and this will make more sense as I continue forward, versus a hunter, because I wanted Jake to be a little bit different, who again was the protagonist. So the next step, you'll see that I continued putting these little spots in here and continued documenting things. So then I started talking a little bit more about where our attention comes from, where reality is seen from. And so I started just doing a little bit of research saying, okay, interesting, there's something called the parietal eye, iris, aperture, diaphragm, coming up with some good language that I could use as I'm writing this story. And I continued to put in here some different things like exploring, seeing versus chasing, stopping the world and what that might do. I actually put in some things here around inner silence and just things that I could use as I'm writing the story to remind me. And at this point, I actually started putting some words on paper and started writing some scenes around this and started connecting these, because this is the power. After you have your scenes in here, then you basically can write transitions between them, so you can spend time writing the scene that you wanted, and then you need to transition between those scenes because you know what your next scene is going to look like. So if the characters need to develop, or if you need to introduce supporting characters to help drive it forward, it made it very easy for me to kind of go through and do this. So then, as you can see, I started even putting more information in here, like, ooh, it would be interesting to bring in some entities from other realms. And I started thinking about what they may look like and how they may sound and what their attributes might be. And then I started talking about other things that support these individual scenes. And I used this little thing to add some visuals to the story. So like, ooh, when one of the characters is actually on the astral realm, what would that look like? And if they encountered an entity, what might that entity look like? And I was like, ooh, it might be interesting if they had like white pearly scales and they, didn't necessarily move like normal people. They kind of stop motioned through, right? All of these ideas come to us, and sometimes it's hard to remember what you had thought. So this was very useful for me as I was writing back here and started thinking more about these entities. Then I would start thinking, because creativity kind of happens in bursts, and I'd be like, ooh, what might they look like? And then if I didn't actually make note of some of this, like moves point, bloody nose, eyes roll back, if I didn't have these descriptions that I thought about as I was developing some of these other things and I was writing back here, by the time I got up here, I may not remember some of those ideas. So I did this as a really good sandbox to kind of help remember descriptions and visuals and interactions. And I also use this top of the timeline to really bring in when these characters would be actually involved in the story. Also, if you remember when I talked about kind of my development, and this is basically the development of the magical mechanisms, but it could be learning of a character too. It could be a religious journey. It could be a self-discovery journey. And there may be things that they learn along the way that you don't want the reader to understand all at once. So you could use the same type of thing to really even be a friendship as it develops over time, or as somebody becomes more sinister through the story. You can actually do this and easily track it within your timeline. So you can see this is really when they start seeing some new differences in reality. And then there's kind of training sessions they have along the way. And I could map those directly to the scenes, because that's when the protagonist and some of the supporting characters would talk about different things. For instance, at Cooper's Falls, they discuss energy, but there's a prowling entity that's coming around, and it's creating some conflict. And it's actually a time when Brooke and Johnny and Jake are actually doing a quick little weekend camping, and they kind of tell their parents they're going to be away. And that's the first time they kind of interact with Emma as well, one of the supporting characters. But if you look here, I have 4 and 5, which map to right here. So they're really talking about the shared description of reality, how it's important to save energy by having perfect actions every time, basically living like your moment on Earth is the last one you'll have. And there's no reason not to treat every moment as if it's your last stand. So you want to be as perfect as possible at all times. I also talked about things like stopping the world, and how you can see these energy fibers that really connect to everything in the universe. And then in 5, I really get into some of the concepts around intent and will, how you can pull on your own sense of self without having ego blinding you and creating a reality for you, and use that to drive your energy to do things. And then I talk about the difference between being a seer and being a sorcerer, and needing to move the cluster, which is really what forms our view of reality. So as you can see in my story, I actually was talking about that in this Cooper Falls setting, and actually was able to trigger a little bit around. Again, I had already started writing a little bit at this time, but I found that it was important for me to have these placeholders that I could go and put ideas. Because as you can see, it continued to grow. I decided that in one of my scenes when Jake had a presentation he had to make, I captured this piece from Hamlet because I thought it would be hilarious for him to recite this big elaborate monologue in front of the class and then have a little interesting twist where he was leveraging the energy and the magical powers that he's developed because he's been saving energy. And I started marking things red, making it easy for me to stay in tune with what comes next. So as you can see, if you look at this and even stop the video, you can see there's a lot of information that I was actually capturing in here. And then as it continued to move it forward, and until I got to that last moment, which was really the end of my story. I found this was extremely helpful for me to manage time. I thought extremely helpful to manage your character and character development, and also make sure I didn't have inconsistencies in my story. You know, I couldn't have a character act one way if they hadn't learned how to do that particular thing that I had them doing. So I thought this was useful. I thought it might be helpful for other people to see it as well. So that's what I wanted to show.